Hey guys, this video lecture is about the dawn of the Progressive Era, which is a period of time that pretty much stretches from about 1890 to 1920. Please make sure you're taking notes. So, as you're taking notes, something that you might want to do as a left side entry is think about this question, and then kind of return to it and maybe write a paragraph response after you're done watching the whole video. The question is, how did progressivism aim to address the problems faced by the working class? That should become obvious as we go along here, but if it doesn't, it's probably a good question to go back to, because it's a question that will really help you understand this movement. So the seeds for the Progressive Era are really sown during the Gilded Age, which we've been talking about for what feels like forever in our class at this point. Many middle-class Americans, as people like Jacob Riis and others are bringing attention to sort of these terrible conditions, are really shocked by this and feel an urge to do something to make some change. So there's a couple different ways that this happens. There are some charity movements that develop. Often these are women's groups, they might be church-related groups, and they're practicing what they call the social gospel, which is the idea that it's their obligation to take care of people who are in need. This is a very, very middle-class movement. These are not your Rockefellers and your Carnegies, but this is also not a movement led by people who are maybe living in or experiencing the worst conditions. It's mostly a group of comfortable middle-class people, and it's very much driven by their belief that their values as middle-class Americans are what will help people from living in terrible conditions. So they're really encouraging people to adopt and believe in the things that they believe in. There's also a movement called the settlement movement, which puts reformers, again, those middle-class reformers, right in the middle of communities of people who are maybe of the working class and who are experiencing these really terrible conditions. Which is sort of interesting because it takes these middle-class, comfortable Americans and makes them maybe a little bit more uncomfortable in ways that help them really become effective to do their work. So here's an example of what one of those settlement houses might have looked like. These settlement houses were places where immigrants could come in and settle in a community before maybe finding housing or something on their own, or having to resort to finding housing and support through a political machine and then tying themselves to a corrupt political process. So you can kind of see from this obviously is the teacher. Her clothes are very conservative. She is very much looking like a middle-class person, and this room really has a sort of middle-class feel to it. It's much nicer than the tenement living conditions that we saw maybe in How the Other Half Lives. The most famous of all of these settlements is still around today, and it is right here in Chicago. It is called the Hull House. It's located on Halstead Avenue on the UIC campus, and today is the Jane Addams Hull House Memorial Museum. It's really, really cool. It's one of the takeout menu options for this quarter, and if you want to check it out, they do have public tours, I believe, on the weekends. You can check their website for more information. So Jane Addams is the person who founded the Hull House. And she, with her business partner, Ellen Gates Starr, and her mantra, as herself a very comfortable middle-class woman who is really looking to make change in society, here's a quote from her. She wanted to teach by example, practice cooperation, and practice social democracy, that is, egalitarian or democratic social relations across class lines. So the Hull House was really her opportunity to kind of put this philosophy into practice, teaching immigrant families not only skills and trades, and giving them opportunities for recreation and leisure, but also trying to promote a particular view of democracy. Jane Addams would go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1930s. She's one of the most famous peace activists in women's history, and also has a very thick CIA file on her, which they have on display at the Hull House if you go and check it out. So people like Jane Addams and middle-class reformers, progressives who are interested in these sort of this movement are very influenced by the development of sociology as a discipline, as an academic field that people could research and learn in and then teach to others. Sociology didn't really exist as a field until about the early 1900s. The best definition that we have comes from Pierre-Auguste Comte, who says that sociology is the study of how people interact with each other in society. Not terribly challenging, since sociology is kind of, the word society is already in there. But what sociologists end up doing is that they're taking data on societies and people's movements within them and kind of measuring them against theories of human behavior. If we have a theory that people should behave in a certain way, are they actually behaving that way? It also makes people like settlement workers and other reformers have a little bit more gravitas, a little bit more seriousness to their work because they now are practicing a science. So this isn't just charity, it isn't just kind of a social mission, it's also a scientific mission as well. What a lot of reformers end up doing, though, with this sort of scientific background and this desire to kind of promote their own values among classes of people who maybe don't share those values, is that they get a little bit controlling in the way that they want to actually make change. We've already talked in this class about the rise of immigration during this period, but one of the effects of that, in addition to swelling the working classes and leading to things like slum conditions and tenements, is that we have a rise of what's called nativism during this period. Nativism is where Americans favor people who are native-born Americans, people who are either second or third or fourth generation American citizens. And we've seen this a little bit before already in the Chinese Exclusion Act and other immigration restrictions that are passed during this time. Even the Contract Labor Act, which was one of those acts that had really pulled immigrants from other community or other parts of the world to the United States, is repealed by Congress in 1885. So that's not great. So even though the progressives are often considered some of the most enlightened people in society at this time, they are also not immune to racism and prejudice towards other people, particularly immigrants. Another way that progressive reformers try to kind of impose their ideas on others is through prohibition, which is the making alcohol and drinking alcohol illegal. Prohibition seeks to reduce personal tragedies caused by drinking, which might look like not being able to do your job, not being able to provide for your family, getting injured on the job, having a husband who abuses you after he's been drinking. All of these things were kind of unspoken problems of drinking, and prohibitionists or people who supported temperance really brought these issues to the fore. There's also a desire to protect public morals from vice, which we've talked about a little bit in a previous EPAS, I think, when we were reading Devil in the White City. Vice is immoral or corrupt behavior. And so there are laws that are passed during this time that are trying to protect people from immoral behavior. One of the most famous ones, the Comstock Law, is passed by Purity crusader whose name is Anthony Comstock, which makes it illegal to transmit obscene materials through the mail. Some of those obscene materials might include information about preventing pregnancy, because in order to talk about birth control and how to prevent pregnancy, you have to kind of describe how people get pregnant. So Margaret Sanger and some of the other activists who are looking to protect women in this way actually find themselves at odds with the laws of the United States during this period, because in order to talk about the things that they want to change in society, they have to bring up some obscene information. In general, the main important thing to know about progressivism is that it responds to urban issues. It's not really a movement that... My cat is running around. It's not really a movement that is looking at the country, at the farmers, and we'll get more to the movement that really focuses on them later in class. But progressivism is really focused on issues that affect the urban poor, many of whom are immigrants during this time. And a lot of these we've talked about already in class, right? Poor living and working conditions, low incomes, and cycles of unemployment where people don't get paid very much and then they get laid off, and then they get hired again at a very low wage, and then they get laid off, and it's kind of an endless cycle. The growing gap between the rich and the poor, which is one of the sort of defining characteristics of the Gilded Age, and then social services that are being hindered by political corruption. So places where maybe the city of Chicago or the state of New York had some laws in place that were meant to help people, but that were getting kind of held up by the deal-making, the political machines, the corruption between public officials, and maybe funds for those programs being siphoned off into contracts that are favoring a particular group, sort of like what we talked about in class earlier this week. So progressives could have been from any political party at this time. They could be Republicans, they could be Democrats, they could be populists, who we'll talk about a little bit later, but most of them agree on sort of four main things. First of all, they believe that government should be accountable to citizens. So the government should have to, if the people have a question or a problem and bring it up before the government, it's the government's duty to respond to that. They also believe that government should curb the power of the wealthy. Remember, this is coming out of the Gilded Age, when we have people who have made their fortunes and who have extreme power in all parts of society, politically as well as economically. Progressives believe that it's up to the government to kind of even the playing field a little bit and take maybe some of that power away, or at least make sure that wealthy people are not being corrupted and using their power inappropriately. They believe that government should have the power to help citizens, meaning that the government should be able to pass laws that are going to have sweeping effects in society. And finally, they believe that government itself should be more efficient and less corrupt. And so not only are they trying to make sure that wealthy people are not corrupt, they're trying to make sure that government officials don't become wealthy through corruption as well. So there's a couple organizations that develop. Some progressives, like who we explored yesterday in our conference, become well known as individuals, but some of them are also more powerful as leaders of organizations or as parts of organizations. The labor movement really expands during this period. Some of you read about Samuel Gompers yesterday, who of course is the founder of the American Federation of Labor. The labor movement in general supports union activity and union movement, and it builds on a momentum that starts in the 1890s for workers to engage in what's called collective bargaining. So instead of making an individual contract with an employer, the employer has to make a contract with all the members of that union, which makes all that group of people much stronger as a whole than any one of them could be individually. We also see the growth of socialism and socialist organizations at this time. Socialism we've talked about a little bit. Just to remind you, it's an economic and political philosophy that favors public control of property and income. And when we say public, we mean government. It's opposed to capitalism in that way, where capitalism believes that property and income should really be privately controlled by individuals. The Socialist Party of America, oops, that says American, it should say America, forms for the first time in 1901 and will stick around and become a force at various points of our history ever since that time. Finally, there are several women's groups that develop during this time that are not necessarily interested in women's rights, but are opportunities for women to get involved in social issues, which then starts to kind of build some momentum for the later suffrage movement, which we'll get to soon. One of these, an important one, is the National Consumers League. So looking at women as the people who are primarily making the buying decisions for the household, the people who buy the food, the people who buy the clothes, the household tools, things like that. So this group, much like Upton Sinclair in the Jungle, is really key in investigating factory conditions. If they're the people who are buying things, they want to know what the conditions are in the places where those things are made. Women are also very involved at this time in the temperance movement, which is interested in prohibition, and they're just beginning to be interested in women's suffrage, which of course is the vote at this time, although women will not receive the vote until several years later when we get more into the imperialist age of American history. So perhaps you're thinking to yourself, well, it sounds like everyone's a progressive during this period, which isn't exactly true. There are a few groups of people who are decidedly not progressive and who are very opposed to what the progressives were trying to do. First of all, people who are conservatives, politically conservative. They disagreed with the idea of giving government more control over people's lives. They wanted things to kind of remain as they had been, more of a government hands-off sort of atmosphere, and didn't want to see change in that area. Business owners are also, in many cases, very opposed to what progressive reformers were doing. Reformers threaten the profitability of businesses, right? We talked about this in class. It costs you more to put regulations in place or put safety precautions in place for your workers, you as a business owner might be looking to cut costs anywhere you can and feel like that impedes your ability to make as much profit as you possibly can. Interestingly, some of the people who are also opposed to the progressives are the very groups that progressives were trying to help. For example, one of the major progressive reforms was decreasing child labor. And children would benefit from having labor laws that wouldn't require them to work 12 hours a day in terrible conditions. But their families might depend on the wages that children were bringing in from working those long hours in order to survive. So while progressives were maybe trying to protect children, their parents were saying, we really need our children to be going to work, and it's our decision whether or not we want to send them. So there's kind of a question about whether or not the progressives were insensitive. I leave it to you to think about that and reflect on that on your own, and we will pick up soon with the other group interested in rural issues who were the populists. Good luck with your notes.